I am deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty.
So, a highly confidential document containing the final wishes of a dead patriarch was deliberately buried for half a decade deep inside the royal archives. King Charles discovered it not through a formal legal briefing, but with his own trembling hands, breaking a faded wax seal on a navy blue leather box hidden away in a dimly lit drawer at Windsor Castle. The royal archives have always existed in a world apart from the chaos of the modern age. It is a place where time seems permanently frozen behind thick stone walls and towering oak shelves. In this hushed silence, filled with the heavy scent of old paper and leather bindings, the king sat completely isolated. Since the day his beloved father passed away, Charles had shouldered a kingdom through countless public storms, facing ever-widening rifts within his own bloodline. Now, seeking a rare moment of solace among the historical records of his ancestry, his fingers brushed against a texture that did not belong among the routine administrative files. It was the distinctive, sharp handwriting of the late Duke of Edinburgh. As the brittle wax crumbled under his touch, the words that emerged carried the breath of the past, yet held a terrifying emotional weight. This was no standard state paper. It was a secret will, one that poured a father's entire heart into the personal distribution of his most cherished possessions. Specifically, his vast library of over 13,000 books, meant entirely for his youngest son. But the shock was not in the inheritance itself. The true horror lay in the absolute void surrounding its existence. When a monarch or a senior royal passes, their final decrees are handled by a fortress of elite lawyers and trusted advisors. The system is designed to be impenetrable. Yet, this profoundly significant envelope had vanished without a single whisper from the palace machinery. A document of this magnitude does not simply slip behind a desk or get misfiled in the wrong cabinet. The royal archival system is universally renowned for its ruthless, meticulous rigor. Every single piece of paper, every artifact, every movement is aggressively tracked and recorded. That's not a simple administrative oversight. That's a calculated, institutional erasure. The handover records from the Duke's office in the spring of that fateful year were not just missing. They had been crudely torn out, hastily replaced with vague, typed papers entirely lacking proper legal signatures. Furthermore, the digital security cameras monitoring the West Corridor leading directly to that specific vault had conveniently lost their signal for exactly 15 minutes every single afternoon. During the week, the will was supposedly sealed. Someone with supreme, unquestionable authority had to walk down that corridor. Someone had to physically pull the original pages, tear the logs, and insert the fabricated replacements. You do not blind the security apparatus of Windsor Castle by accident. You do not tear the official logs of a dead prince because you were in a rush. The king remained frozen in the shadowed corner of the room, clutching the stiff parchment as a sickening realization washed over him. Every instinct honed by decades spent in the shadow of his mother told him that whoever orchestrated this was not a rogue staff member. Lower-level employees do not possess the clearance to command camera blackouts, nor do they have the brazen confidence to destroy the final written requests of the longest-serving royal consort in history. The perpetrator had to be someone whose orders were absolute, someone whose mere presence demanded unquestioning compliance from the household staff. The terrifying silence surrounding this document was engineered. It required systemic manipulation, utilizing the very mechanisms built to protect the crown to instead betray one of its most loyal servants. The person responsible knew exactly how the palace operated, knew exactly where the blind spots were, and knew exactly how to use the chaos of a global crisis and a highly publicized mourning period to bury a truth they did not want to see realized. This wasn't a family misunderstanding over a forgotten inheritance. This was a silent, calculated coup executed from the very top of the institution to strip a loyal son of his birthright. Before we go any further, subscribe to Royal Signal so you don't miss what comes next. There's a lot more to this story, and it's still unfolding. The whole thing actually starts with the quiet, seemingly routine cataloging of a 13,000-volume personal library, and almost nobody paid attention at the time. When the late Duke of Edinburgh passed away, the immediate focus of the global press was entirely consumed by the monumental scale of the loss and the stark visual of a socially distanced funeral. In the chaotic, grief-stricken aftermath, the palace staff was tasked with quietly sorting through a lifetime of personal artifacts. Among these was an extensive, deeply cherished collection of rare books, historical texts, and cultural heirlooms tucked away in a private wing. It was treated as a low-priority administrative task, a mere footnote in the overwhelming machinery of royal transition. Nobody looking at the ledger realized that this simple inventory process was the actual fire underneath everything that followed. It seemed trivially small compared to the shifting of crowns, yet it set the stage for a silent war over legacy, control, and birthright. The public narrative presented to the world during that spring was a masterpiece of institutional choreography. The official palace announcements and tightly controlled television broadcasts said the monarchy was completely united in its mourning, which made everyone assume the late Duke's final affairs were being settled with the utmost reverence, familial loyalty, and seamless respect. The world saw a family standing shoulder to shoulder in the chapel, putting their sworn duty above all internal friction. But according to what is now coming out, during that exact same time frame, a chilling private reality was already in motion. Behind closed doors, while the choirs sang and the nation wept, a highly classified, digitized directive was quietly circulating through the palace's secure internal servers. This confidential order explicitly instructed the Asset Records Department to immediately freeze and withhold all documents related to the cultural legacy and copyright controls from the late Duke's library. Furthermore, it deliberately postponed the promised transfer of oversight regarding the Duke of Edinburgh's award fund to the youngest prince. The massive gap between the solemn public tears broadcast globally and this ruthless clandestine asset freeze executed internally is the very engine of this story. And the sole beneficiary of this calculated strategic delay was the private office of the woman who would soon be crowned queen. By hijacking the paperwork, her operation successfully consolidated highly symbolic assets, quietly neutralizing any potential shift of independent influence toward the late Duke's dutiful, favored son. Someone inside the highest echelons of the royal household made the active, calculated decision to suppress the original will and let the family believe a completely false version of events. This was never a passive omission. It was not a file accidentally slipping through the cracks of a busy transition. According to newly recovered internal logs, the sealed navy blue envelope containing the final wishes first reached a small, trusted team of aides. However, before it could be delivered to the Royal Legal Council or to the newly grieving monarch, an urgent written request intercepted the chain of custody. The document was aggressively redirected straight to Queen Camilla's private office. For 3 full days, that envelope sat on a heavy mahogany desk, its contents entirely known, its instructions crystal clear. And then, the decision was made to bury it, hiding it away in an obscure archive drawer while allowing the public to believe the late Duke had simply left his affairs unresolved. Because if you are the Princess Royal, and you have just quietly noticed unauthorized transfers of your father's charitable funds through routine internal audits, you are not thinking about simple paperwork errors, administrative backlogs, or temporary household confusion. You are thinking about a systemic, deliberate siege on the family's core assets, realizing that the very person standing closest to the king has been orchestrating a silent takeover of the bloodline's inheritance for half a decade. The truth was discovered not through a formal announcement or a scheduled briefing, but via digital ghosts resurrected under the quiet ticking of an antique clock. A senior cybersecurity expert, working late in a sequestered wing of the palace, had left the final recovery log glowing on an unattended monitor while retrieving a file. A passing household staff member, merely attempting to deliver a fresh pot of tea to the study, accidentally glanced at the screen. The servant froze instantly, recognizing the highly restricted seal of the Queen Consort's private office, positioned directly beside a classified digital suppression order from the exact week of the late Duke's funeral. Queen Camilla did not find out about this discovery directly from her husband. The devastating blow was delivered through her own private secretary, who hastily pulled her aside into a dimly lit antechamber just moments before a scheduled diplomatic reception. The secretary spoke in that careful, cold tone people use when they know their words are about to detonate, quietly informing her that the deeply buried digital signatures had been fully flagged and recovered by the king's internal audit. Before the Queen Consort could even form a sentence, the color drained entirely from her face. Her hands instinctively gripped the edge of a heavy mahogany table, her knuckles turning white as she absorbed the reality that her most guarded operation had been breached without a single warning. The inevitable confrontation finally occurred within the suffocating, sealed silence of the royal council chamber. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut, the queen consort launched into a defense deeply rooted in what she believed she had rightfully earned. Her voice trembled with a wounded, defensive pride, arguing that every decision her camp allegedly made was for the ultimate preservation of the monarchy. She reminded him that she had endured decades of vicious public vilification, fighting relentlessly through storms of scandal to stand by his side. She felt entitled to manage the internal assets of the household to protect his reign from unnecessary distractions, framing the suppression of the younger prince's inheritance not as theft, but as a necessary consolidation of institutional power. She believed she had earned the absolute right to act as the ultimate gatekeeper of the family's legacy. King Charles sat completely motionless, his face carved from granite. When he finally responded, his voice was utterly devoid of the emotional weight of their long marriage. He stripped away the personal narrative entirely, focusing solely on the cold, structural integrity of the monarchy. He did not address her sacrifices, her tears, or their decades of shared history. Instead, he dissected the legal and moral violation of hiding a former patriarch's final. He made it terrifyingly clear that the mechanics of the royal archives operate entirely independent of personal grievances. Then, looking directly at the woman he had fought the entire world to marry, he delivered a verdict that retroactively redefined their entire existence together. The Crown's archives do not exist to be weaponized against its own bloodline. After those words fell, he said nothing more. The king offered no comforting gesture, no softening of his rigid posture, and no room for further debate. His silence told everyone in the room that this was his final, unbreakable answer. He did not call after her. He stayed exactly where he was, deliberately turning his gaze away from her trembling figure. With agonizing slowness, he reached out and methodically aligned the edges of the recovered financial audit reports on his desk, his eyes fixing permanently on the broken wax seal of the navy blue leather box. That physical act of organizing the evidence, choosing to prioritize the late Duke's stolen legacy over the emotional collapse of his wife, was a rejection far more brutal than any shouted argument could ever achieve. What Queen Camilla carried out of that room was a wound that cut far deeper than a mere administrative defeat. This confrontation did not create a new insecurity. It violently reopened a decades-old scar. For years, she had fought against the whispering narrative that she was an outsider who would never truly belong to the sacred, institutional core of the family. Being quietly stripped of her authority and reprimanded before the council proved that, in the ultimate hierarchy of the palace, she was still secondary to the eternal bloodline. Meanwhile, the king remained seated, bearing the immense, invisible burden of what this choice had cost him. He had chosen the institution and the ghost of his father over the living wife he had spent half his life trying to legitimize. The tragic reality of the king is that he must always choose the crown over the people inside it. And as the queen consort retreated to her private estate, backed into a corner with her greatest fear confirmed, a dark shadow settled over the palace. She had been quietly angling for survival her entire royal life. And a queen who feels she has nothing left to lose is the most unpredictable, dangerous variable this family could ever face. To understand what King Charles is actually protecting, and what the queen consort is truly tampering with, you need to understand what this specific royal archive has already survived. This is not simply a dusty basement filled with forgotten diaries, old administrative receipts, and harmless family memorabilia. This vault is the absolute, unquestionable heartbeat of the dynasty's survival. For centuries, the documents held within these thick stone walls have possessed the power to crown kings, destroy ancient reputations, and completely rewrite the lineage of the most powerful family on earth. To tamper with it is not a mere administrative error or a lapse in judgment. It is a historical desecration of the highest order. The sheer audacity of intercepting a royal will might feel like a modern, unprecedented scandal engineered for tabloid consumption. But someone came terrifyingly close to executing this exact same theft more than a century ago. When King George IV passed away, his private chambers were entirely compromised by those who feared losing their privileged status. In the chaotic, grief-stricken hours before the official royal seals could be permanently placed on his personal cabinets, a highly coordinated attempt was made by those closest to his bedchamber to quietly remove heavily sealed documents, These papers promised massive financial endowments to unapproved beneficiaries. The method they used mirrors the current threat with chilling precision, causing a deliberate delay in the administrative handover. Utilizing the distracting grief of the court and leveraging their intimate proximity to the crown to bypass standard security protocols, they successfully moved the documents out of the main residence, entirely bypassing the Lord Chamberlain's office. It was only stopped because a single eagle-eyed courtier noticed the broken wax seals on the king's personal ledger and locked down the palace gates before the carriage could depart. The terrifying reality is that the pattern of betrayal from within the inner sanctum is not new at all. The exact same institutional vulnerability that almost cost the crown a fortune back then was just exploited again, using digital delays and camera blackouts instead of horse-drawn carriages and whispered corridor conspiracies. And make no mistake, the contents of these specific archives have a literal documented body count. In the turbulent, violent eras of the Tudor and Stuart reigns, simply possessing unauthorized knowledge of a monarch's private asset distribution was considered an act of high treason. Men were completely ruined, physically tortured, and permanently exiled for merely attempting to forge or conceal the seals of past sovereigns. Consider the grim fate of the ambitious courtiers who attempted to manipulate the dying wishes of King Edward VI to alter the succession and asset lines. They did not face quiet dismissals, early retirements, or internal audits. They faced the executioner's block at the Tower of London. The loyal men who guarded these documents historically paid for their administrative failures with their own blood. The archives were built on the fundamental understanding that the sovereign's final written word is sacred, and anyone who dared to intercept that word was structurally an enemy of the crown itself. The physical history of these vaults is heavily soaked in the destruction of anyone who mistakenly thought they could outsmart the bloodline. But perhaps the most chilling detail is that we have seen this exact psychological dynamic play out before. Look back to the final fading days of King Edward III, when his highly ambitious companion, Alice Perrers, realized her absolute power was entirely dependent on the king's survival. As the monarch lay dying, she did not wait for the formal reading of the wills or the official transition of power. She actively stripped the heavy jeweled rings from his fingers and quietly siphoned away his most valuable personal assets before the royal household could secure the official inventory. She manipulated the transition of wealth to protect her own standing against the legitimate heirs who openly despised her and viewed her as a common intruder. The pattern of an insecure consort grabbing at legacy assets is not new. A woman elevated by the king, realizing her deeply vulnerable position, using the chaos of death to seize the monarch's private legacy before the true, blood-born heirs can claim it. Only the names have changed. And after all of that, after surviving centuries of internal treason, violent usurpation, and the relentless, calculating greed of those adjacent to the throne, this sacred chain of asset transfer was manipulated by the current queen consort in the shadow of a pandemic funeral. She bypassed systems that were literally built on the blood and ruin of historical traitors. Ask yourself if she fully understands the historical weight of what she was tampering with. Because when you play a medieval game of succession and inheritance within the walls of Windsor Castle, you awaken a structural wrath that has been destroying ambitious outsiders for 1,000 years. And this explosion of truth inside the royal council chamber did not come from nowhere. It had been building quietly for decades. This was never a sudden lapse in judgment. It was the latest, fatal entry in a carefully documented pattern of behavior that someone had been silently watching. Years ago, long before the crown formally shifted, a seemingly minor clash occurred that most of the public completely missed. The Princess Royal had requested a minor adjustment regarding a small charitable trust closely associated with her late father's countryside estate. It was a simple administrative request, meant to ensure a seamless transition of a specific agricultural patronage. But the request was inexplicably denied. The denial did not come through a personal phone call or a face-to-face conversation over tea. It came through cold institutional channels, specifically routed from the office where the future queen consort was already quietly consolidating her sphere of influence. Nobody offered an apology. Nobody explained why a blood princess was being locked out of her own father's minor patronages. It was a subtle, almost invisible flex of bureaucratic muscle designed to test the boundaries of control. The Princess Royal said nothing publicly. She did not leak to the press, nor did she throw an emotional tantrum behind closed doors. She simply accepted the bureaucratic wall with her trademark stoicism and returned to her duties, letting the slight fade into the background. But she did not forget. More recently, the exact same pattern repeated, but with significantly higher stakes. Following a major royal transition, several mid-sized properties and financial portfolios belonging to the family's private estates were slated for internal reassignment. The exact access and oversight the Princess Royal had been previously denied suddenly appeared, fully authorized and functioning. Under the direct control of the Queen Consort's newly expanded private office, the Princess Royal did not receive a courtesy briefing. She found out the exact same way the public and the auditors did through cameras and ledger discrepancies, watching from a distance as newly appointed staff moved into offices that should have been managed by the bloodline. It was a brazen escalation, a clear signal that the consolidation of power was no longer just about establishing a royal footprint. It was about systematically locking the born royals out of the institutional wealth. Yet again, she said absolutely nothing publicly. She maintained her rigid loyalty to the crown, smiling for the cameras and carrying out her grueling schedule of engagements without missing a single step. But behind the scenes, she started keeping records. Then came the third time. Except this time, the scale, the stakes, and the sheer audacity were completely different. This was not a minor agricultural charity or a mid-sized estate property. This was a highly confidential document bearing the broken wax seal of the late Duke of Edinburgh himself. The target was a 13,000-volume historical library, and the entirety of the Duke of Edinburgh's award fund. The Queen Consort had used the exact same administrative playbook she had perfected over the years, intercepting the paperwork, delaying the transfer, and burying the truth in the chaos of a transition. She assumed the Princess Royal would stay quiet, just as she had before. She assumed the pattern of silent acceptance would hold, but she grossly underestimated her opponent. According to people who have worked closely with the Princess Royal for years, she kept a private, careful record of every single occasion where financial protocols were mysteriously bypassed. She had been quietly documenting every denied request, every altered ledger, and every sudden shift of property management. She built a silent archive of anomalies, carefully gathering the exact operational data needed to expose the entire strategy. She did not need to shout because she had the receipts. That kind of patient, buried anger tends to be far more dangerous than anything loud. Because it never fades, it only builds, and the person who finally acts on it has been thinking about exactly what to do for a very long time. The Queen Consort thought she was playing a brilliant game of institutional chess against a family paralyzed by protocol. She failed to realize that the Princess Royal had been quietly watching the board for years, merely waiting for the perfect, fatal moment to hand the king the exact weapon he needed. Some of you are probably wondering whether King Charles can even do this legally. Can a reigning monarch simply banish his own queen consort to a secluded countryside estate, violently strip her of her internal administrative access, and completely rewrite the operational hierarchy of the entire palace this fast, all without asking for a single drop of permission or consulting the broader government? The answer is an absolute, unquestionable yes. And understanding the intricate legal mechanics of how he executed this swift removal changes everything you thought you knew about this story. The mechanism at play here is heavily rooted in the sovereign's royal prerogative over the household, operating in strict tandem with the binding bylaws of the royal trust. In plain, unvarnished language, while the king must answer to elected officials regarding national matters of state, within the physical boundaries of the royal estates and the internal management of the family's private assets, his authority is absolute and legally unquestionable. He acts as the sole supreme executive over the institution's inner workings. He does not need a committee to review his decisions regarding who holds the keys to the sacred archives or who is permitted to reside in the private wings of Buckingham Palace. Legally, the king is allowed to do exactly what he did. No permission slip required. No vote taken. Nothing. He can revoke digital access, redirect stolen funds back to the rightful heirs, and command a physical removal from the premises with a single, silent stroke of his fountain pen. What makes this significant isn't just the surface-level family drama. It is the deeper, darker structural truth that the Queen Consort's power was only ever a borrowed illusion, and he possesses the structural right to withdraw it instantly. However, what made this so unusual wasn't whether he had the legal right. It was the terrifying speed, the ruthless timing, the combination of aggressive moves and the total chilling silence that accompanied it. Structural decisions of this immense magnitude, reshuffling the permanent living arrangements of a reigning consort, and transferring the ultimate control of massive institutional trusts normally take months, if not years, of careful, heavily monitored transition planning. There are usually endless preliminary meetings, dedicated transition teams, and carefully crafted media strategies designed specifically to soften the blow for the public and protect the dignity of everyone involved. But this purge happened in a matter of hours. The king convened the council, presented the digital evidence without a word of hesitation, and executed the orders before the ink on the recovered documents was even fully dry. Something this monumental was executed completely in the shadows. When similar restructuring happened in the past, such as the shifting of royal households for other senior family members, the palace issued coordinated statements, updated their official platforms, and held subtle press conferences to explain the new working models to the public. This time, there was nothing. No polite explanation about the queen consort needing a sudden period of rest at her Wiltshire estate, no formal celebratory announcement regarding the youngest prince's sudden elevation to the head of his father's award fund. Just a quiet registry update and a ruthless internal security directive buried deeply where nobody would ever think to look, permanently severing her private office from the central communications network. And that silence screams louder than any press release ever could. Everyone in that building already knows exactly what's coming. Look closely at the sheer velocity of the racing clock. The summoning of the cybersecurity expert, the immediate convening of the Royal Council, the instant, silent transfer of the Golden Archive key to the youngest brother, the quiet termination of the Queen's digital clearances, and the sudden, unannounced departure of the black vehicles heading toward the countryside. Each move individually might look like routine administrative housekeeping. Stacked together, they reveal a terrifying pattern of absolute, unforgiving urgency. Royal historians who have studied past reigns say they cannot find another example of this many major powers shifting this fast without an official announcement ever confirming why. The consequences of that silent council meeting are already bleeding into the daily physical reality of the royal household this very week. According to sources close to the household, the Queen Consort's private office suite on the upper level of the palace has been effectively hollowed out. A massive mahogany desk, once the bustling nerve center of her daily operations, now sits completely empty, systematically stripped of its files, correspondence folders, and digital terminals. She has skipped several minor engagements she would normally never miss, including a highly anticipated charity reception in the capital. Her remaining staff members are described as unusually withdrawn, refusing to confirm or deny her upcoming schedule to the press corps. Meanwhile, heavy oak doors that were previously always open to senior advisors now stay firmly closed and locked from the inside. Silence inside, a family built entirely on carefully managed public appearances, is rarely ever just silence. It is almost always a decision being made behind closed doors. That is not a temporary scheduling conflict. That is a darker structural truth asserting itself, physically erasing her footprint from the center of power. But the erasure is not stopping at an empty office suite. According to people familiar with private discussions happening inside the palace, a massive, highly classified legal review is quietly being prepared in the background. The king's senior constitutional lawyers have been tasked with auditing the intricate framework of the sovereign grant and the private royal revenues. They are meticulously separating the financial streams that flow into the Queen Consort's charitable trusts from the main institutional accounts. This isn't standard annual auditing. It is a targeted financial severing. By utilizing the archaic rules of the royal trusts, the king's legal team is essentially building a financial firewall around the bloodline. They are preparing the exact institutional mechanisms required to permanently freeze her operational budget without requiring any parliamentary approval or public debate. A detail that has never been said publicly until now is that every single legal tie connecting her private operation to the crown's central wealth is being quietly, methodically cut. Her weakness was always the gap between what she wanted and what she was actually allowed to control, and that gap is now being codified into law. And this is where the timeline gets genuinely dark, leading to the one outcome nobody wants to say out loud, but everyone in that building is thinking. At least one senior legal advisor has reportedly raised a possibility dark enough to shake anyone who thinks this story is finished. A formal, permanent separation of duties leading to an unprecedented institutional exile for a reigning consort. A complete, unceremonious removal of her public patronages and a permanent banishment to the Wiltshire estate, effectively stripping her of any active role in the monarchy. State it plainly, nothing this total, this legally binding, and this unprecedented has ever been attempted this far in advance of a monarch's twilight years, which means everything the king has just survived might not be the end of this war at all. It might only be the opening shot. The true scope of this fracture cannot stay hidden forever, because a relentless deadline is rapidly approaching. In a matter of weeks, the highly publicized, formal state anniversary honoring the late Duke of Edinburgh will take place. It is an unavoidable public appearance where the entire royal family must stand shoulder to shoulder under the global spotlight. Yet, palace staff have quietly started using language normally reserved for occasions of historic finality when discussing the seating arrangements and the official procession order. Extra protocol preparations are underway to physically distance the king's immediate retinue from the consort's remaining staff. A logistical separation that nobody has explained and nobody has denied. Even the ceremonial carriages are being routed differently to avoid shared arrivals. Ask yourself why a completely bifurcated arrival protocol, separate motorcades, and divided seating would be necessary for an ordinary family memorial service. And you already know why so many people close to this family believe they know exactly what's coming. Miles away from the suffocating gilded grandeur of Buckingham Palace, the Queen Consort stood perfectly still behind the heavy, rain-streaked glass windows of her private Wiltshire estate. The long gravel driveway, stretching out before her, was entirely empty, swept completely clean of the massive security motorcade that had reliably accompanied her every single move for the past 2 decades. She did not speak a single word. She did not approach the heavy wooden doors to demand answers from the few remaining loyal staff members hovering nervously in the corridors. She merely stood there, an isolated figure shrouded in the gathering dusk, watching the towering iron gates that had quietly closed on the absolute institutional power she could no longer claim. There was no argument left to make, no brilliant public relations strategy to deploy, and absolutely no ally left to call within the sovereign's inner circle. Her total silence in that fading afternoon light was the chilling physical realization of her own absolute defeat. She had painstakingly built an impenetrable fortress of influence over half a lifetime, only to watch it systematically dismantled in a single afternoon by a ghost holding a fountain pen. The real question was never whether a deeply buried envelope containing the final handwritten wishes of a dead patriarch could be miraculously recovered after 5 long years in the dark. It was always whether the ancient monarchy could survive the terrifying, corrosive rot discovered inside its very own inner sanctum, orchestrated by the one person meant to share the ultimate, crushing burden of the crown. The invisible war raging behind the palace walls is no longer about the rightful inheritance of a library holding 13,000 books, nor is it about the administrative management of a global charitable fund. It is about the absolute, ruthless purity of the sovereign bloodline and the brutal, unforgiving mechanisms required to protect that lineage from ambitious outsiders. And whether the sacred title of Queen Consort will even still belong to the woman isolated in Wiltshire by the time the rapidly approaching memorial service forces this irreparably fractured family back onto the global stage. History doesn't usually announce itself with a press release. It does not arrive neatly packaged in official palace statements, nor is it politely handed out to royal correspondents in a brightly lit media briefing room. History happens exactly here, in the cold shadows of a quiet countryside estate where a deeply disgraced consort realizes she has absolutely nowhere left to run. It happens in the heavy, agonizing silence of a tragic king who must ultimately choose the cold, structural survival of his dynasty over the fragile, shattered remnants of his own long-fought marriage. It happens in the specific, physical click of a heavy leather briefcase closing inside a locked council room, permanently severing decades of carefully engineered power without a single drop of visible public outrage. And as the dark, threatening storm clouds gather over Windsor, ahead of a public reckoning that will inevitably force every single member of this ancient institution to finally choose a side, the very ground beneath the throne is already shifting entirely.